Chapter 2.7 Further evidence of the three fundamental truths as provided by religion, mythology, profound thinkers, and primatological and anthropological studies. And tellingly, this awareness that humans did once live in a pre-conscious and pre-human condition afflicted, peaceful, cooperative, selfless, loving ideal state is something all our religions and mythologies recognise. In addition to Moses' account of Adam and Eve's innocent heritage in the Garden of Eden, the Bible also contains a passage in Ecclesiastes that reads, "God made mankind upright, uncorrupted, but men have gone in search of many schemes, conscious understandings," and the references Christ made to a time when God loved us before the creation of the upset, fallen, corrupted world, and a time of the glory before the corrupted world began. Taoist scripture also features a description of our distant forebears as being the men of perfect virtue, while Zen Buddhism similarly speaks of the loss of an uncontaminated, pure state as a result of the intervening conscious mind, referring to the affective contamination, klesha, or the interference of the conscious mind predominated by intellection, vijnana. And prior to Plato and his vast contribution, including his two-horse chariot account of our state of innocence before we had any experience of evils to come, when we were admitted to the sight of apparitions innocent and simple, calm and happy, which we beheld shining in pure light, pure ourselves and not yet enshrined in that living tomb which we carry about now that we are imprisoned, and his reversed cosmos description of our species past, blessed and spontaneous life where neither was there any violence or devouring of one another, or war or quarrel among them. And they dwelt naked and mostly in the open air, and they had no beds but lay on soft couches of grass. There was his aforementioned compatriot Hesiod, who, in his epic poem Works and Days, said of our distant ancestors that when gods alike and mortals rose to birth, a golden race the immortals formed on earth. Like gods they lived, with calm untroubled mind, free from the toils and anguish of our kind, nor ere decrepit age misshaped their frame. Strangers to ill their lives in feast flowed by, dying they sank in sleep, nor seemed to die. Theirs was each good. The life-sustaining soil yielded its copious fruits, unbribed by toil. They with abundant goods, midst quiet lands, all willing, shared the gathering of their hands. The consistency of all these descriptions of how consciousness led to the corruption of our species' original or loving cooperative state has been borne out by the investigations of the author Richard Heinberg, who found that every human culture has a myth involving both the emergence of consciousness and a fall from an original golden age of togetherness and peace. From the major religions to races as isolated and diverse as the Eskimos, Aborigines and Native Americans. Summarising in his 1990 book Memories and Visions of Paradise, a well-researched collection of acknowledgements from mythologies and religions of our species' innocent Edenic past, that every religion begins with the recognition that human consciousness has been separated from the divine source, that a former sense of oneness has been lost. Everywhere in religion and myth, there is an acknowledgement that we have departed from an original innocence and can return to it only through the resolution of some profound inner discord. The cause of the fall is described variously as disobedience, as the eating of a forbidden fruit, and as spiritual amnesia, alienation. Yes, as Berdyaev recognised, the memory of a lost paradise, of a golden age, is very deep in man. So when John Milton titled his epic 1667 poem Paradise Lost, He was recognising the existence of this deep memory in man, as were the Australian Aborigines with their memory of a dreamtime. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau also expressed what we all do intuitively know is the truth when he wrote that nothing is more gentle than man in his primitive state. William Wordsworth was another who spoke honestly when he wrote in his 1807 poem Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood. There was a time when meadow, grove and streams, the earth and every common sight, to me did seem, apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. It is not now as it hath been of yore. Turn wheresoe'er I may, by night or day, the things which I've seen I now can see no more. The rainbow comes and goes, and lovely is the rose. The moon doth with delight look round her when the heavens are bare. Waters on a starry night are beautiful and fair. The sunshine is a glorious birth. But yet I know, where'er I go, that there has passed away a glory from the earth. Something that is gone. Whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory and the dream? Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul, the instinctive memory of our species past all loving, selfless, cooperative existence, that rises with us, that we are born with, our life star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar, not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come, from God who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy, and by the vision splendid is on his way attended. At length the man perceives it die away, and fade into the light of common day. Forget the glories he hath known, and that imperial palace whence he came. This beautiful description by Wordsworth of our original instinctive self or soul equates perfectly with that given by the poet Henry Vaughan when he wrote in 1655, "My soul, there is a country far beyond the stars." The sentiment is also reflected in the words of the polymath Sir Thomas Browne, who said in 1643, "We carry within us all the wonders we seek without us," and in the poet Lord Byron's observation from 1816 that man is in part divine, a troubled stream from a pure source. With regard to Wordsworth's reference to God, as outlined earlier and as will be explained in chapter 4.3, God is our personification of the terrifyingly confronting truth of the teleological, integrative, order of matter developing, cooperative, selfless, loving theme or direction or meaning of existence that our distant ancestors lived in accordance with, but which we no longer appear to. And, like Lang, the prophet Isaiah recognized how upset or corrupted we humans have become, but was more specific about how it is a corruption of this integrated state that we once lived in, writing in the Bible that from the sole of your foot to the top of your head there is no soundness, only wounds and welts and open sore. Your country is desolate. The faithful city has become a harlot. She once was full of justice. Righteousness used to dwell in her. And the world languishes and withers. The earth is defiled by its people. They have disobeyed the laws, become divisively rather than integratively behaved. In the streets, all joy turns to gloom. All gaiety is banished from the earth. And this people's heart has become calloused, alienated. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. The consistency of these accounts is remarkable. But beyond what is revealed by myth, religion and profound thought, consider the evidence provided by our studies in anthropology and primatology. While fossils of our early ape ancestors who lived from 12 to 4 million years ago are rare, recent discoveries from this period are now providing proof of a cooperative past, which anthropologists are beginning to admit. For instance, C. Owen Lovejoy has written that our species-defining cooperative mutualism can now be seen to extend well beyond the deepest Pliocene, well beyond 5.3 million years ago. In primatology, studies of living apes reveal that bonobos, Pan paniscus, are not only humans' closest relatives, but an extremely gentle and cooperative species. While bonobos and chimpanzees, Pan troglodyte, both share around 99% of humans' genetic material, the primatologist Frans de Waal points out that the recent discovery by neuroscientist Elizabeth Hammock and Larry Young in 2005 that bonobos and humans share genetic code in relation to affiliative, social, cohesive, loving, integrative behaviour that is absent in the chimpanzee, indicates bonobos and humans are more closely related in terms of their social nature. The anthropologist Adrian Zillman has also shown that of bonobos and chimpanzees, bonobos are closer anatomically to our ancestors. As to their peaceful nature, many primatologists attest to it. Consider this from Barbara Fruth. Up to 100 bonobos at a time from several groups spend their night together. That would not be possible with chimpanzees because there would be brutal fighting between rival groups. The evidence of our cooperative past that is provided by anthropology, some of which is referred to above, and by the bonobos, will be documented in some detail in chapters 5.5 and 5.6 respectively. Of course, proof is also apparent in the relative innocence of existing so-called primitive people, such as the Bushmen of the Kalahari, who, according to DNA studies, are the oldest human population on Earth. While some people, such as Carl Jung and Eric Newman, have sought to dismiss the idea of an innocent, Edenic past as nothing more than a nostalgia for the security and maternal warmth of infancy, and certainly never an historical state, the explorer and philosopher Bruce Chatwin bravely rejected this paradise as infancy theory and recognised the relative innocence of these primitive races, writing in his 1987 book The Songlines that every mythology remembers the innocence of the first state. Adam in the garden, the peaceful Hyperboreans, the Uttarakurus, or the men of perfect virtue of the Taoists. Pessimists often interpret the story of the Golden Age as a tendency to turn our backs on the ills of the present and sigh for the happiness of youth. But nothing in Hesiod's text exceeds the bounds of probability. The real or half-real tribes which hover on the fringe of ancient geographies, Atavantes, Fenai, Parasites, or the dancing spermatophagi, have their modern equivalents in the Bushman, the Shoshonean, the Eskimo, and the Aboriginal. The great South African philosopher Sir Lawrence van der Post, whom I consider to be the preeminent philosopher of the 20th century, had an incredibly deep appreciation of the Bushman, and when writing in his 1961 book, The Heart of the Hunter, about the effect of our alienated, innocence-destroyed modern world on their relative innocence, he described how mere contact with 20th century life seemed lethal to the Bushman. He was essentially so innocent and natural a person that he had only to come near us for a sort of radioactive fallout from our unnatural world to produce a fatal leukemia in his spirit. As Plato said, in this tradition of the innocent earthborn man, which is nowadays often unduly discredited, our ancestors, who were nearest in point of time to the end of the last innocent period and came into being at the beginning of this corrupted period, are to us the heralds of that earlier innocent age. Note again that even in the earlier, more innocent times that Plato lived in, recall in chapter 1 that alienation has been increasing from generation to generation ever since the human condition emerged, there was already a strong desire to unduly discredit the truth that our ancestors lived in a pre-human condition afflicted, innocent, blessed, divine, upright, cleanly made, pure, noble, good, modest, honourable, spirited, simple and calm and happy state. Yes, given how extremely condemning and confronting the truth of our species' cooperative, all-loving, innocent past has been, while we couldn't explain our present corrupted, fallen, evil, ignoble, bad, crooked, terrible, unlawful, insolent, prideful, lumbering, disorderly, chaos-causing, increasingly forgetful, deaf, threatening universal ruin to the world, imprisoned in living tomb lives. It is not at all surprising that efforts have been made to discredit this truth of an innocent ancestry as nothing more than nostalgia for the security of infancy, and by claiming that the Bushmen and other primitive races are more warlike and aggressive and less peaceful than the majority of the human race now. This latter ridiculous claim that advanced races are in effect more innocent than primitive races is dealt with later in paragraphs 205 to 208, and more fully in paragraphs 862 to 868. But, of course, as has been mentioned and will shortly be elaborated upon, the main way our innocent past has been denied has been to claim that our distant ancestors were no different from other animals in ferocious competition with each other for food, shelter, territory, and a mate. Further to the numerous acknowledgements and recognitions of a pre-human condition afflicted, all-loving past, some of our greatest contemporary thinkers have also identified the rise of consciousness as being key to understanding and thus resolving our present corrupted, soul-devastated condition. In particular, the just mentioned Sir Lawrence van der Post lifted description of the truth of our species' innocent past and the enormous tragedy of our present consciousness-induced, psychologically upset, corrupted state into the stratosphere of beautiful writing when he composed these words in his 1984 book, Testament to the Bushman. This shrill, brittle, self-important life of today is by comparison a graveyard, where the living are dead and the dead are alive and talking through our instinctive self or soul in the still, small, clear voice of a love and trust in life that we have for the moment lost. There was a time when all on earth and in the universe were still members and family of the early race, seeking comfort and warmth through the long, cold night before the dawning of individual consciousness in a togetherness which still gnaws like an unappeasable homesickness at the base of the human heart. The South African naturalist Eugene Murray, the first person to study primates in their natural habitat, also got to the point of our condition being a psychologically embattled one when he focused on a conflict between our already established instincts and an emerging consciousness, saying in his book The Soul of the Ape, "The highest primate, man, is born an instinctive animal. All its behaviour for a long period after its birth is dominated by the instinctive mentality. It has no memory, no conception of cause and effect, no consciousness. As the individual memory slowly emerges, the instinctive soul becomes just as slowly submerged. For a time, it is almost as though there were a struggle between the two." Yes, the more our conscious mind became criticised by our ideal behaviour expecting instincts, the more we repressed that condemning instinctive awareness, so that it is now submerged into our subconscious. And after a lifetime spent hunting the cause of the human condition, the great Hungarian English polymath Arthur Koestler similarly identified the emergence of consciousness as the catalyst for our condition. The brain explosion gave rise to a mentally unbalanced species in which old brain and new brain, emotion and intellect, faith and reason were at loggerheads. Berdyaev was another who regarded consciousness as an intrinsically important consideration in the quest for self-understanding. The distinction between the conscious and the subconscious mind is fundamental to the new psychology. The very great English biologist Charles Darwin also recognised the acknowledgement of the emergence of consciousness as being fundamental to the new psychology. In fact, he used almost the same words, saying such acknowledgement will mean psychology will be based on a new foundation. While it has been noted that Darwin's seminal 1859 book, The Origin of Species, contains almost no mention of the human species, near the end of the final chapter he did write that, in the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. So while Darwin studiously avoided trying to explain human behaviour in The Origin of Species, he did at least recognise that for light to be thrown on the origin of man and his history, and a new, meaningful, important world of understanding to be opened up, psychology will have to be based on a new foundation of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation, that it will need to recognise the involvement of the emergence of our mental power of consciousness in creating our species' unique, psychologically troubled human condition. Yes, the key to understanding the origin of man's psychology is to recognise the acquirement of our mental power of consciousness. With regard to Darwin not addressing the issue of human behaviour in The Origin of Species, which was a stark omission given the book is titled The Origin of Species, and the most important species we needed to understand the origin of was ourselves, it is true that 12 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, Darwin did publish The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, in which he did make an attempt to look at the origins of our behaviour, but it was still only a tentative step in that all-important exploration. As I talk more about later in paragraph 485, the evidence suggests that while Darwin was honest enough to recognise that trying to address the issue of human behaviour meant addressing the issue of the human condition, he apparently didn't feel secure enough to attempt it himself. In fact, when asked why he didn't address human behaviour in The Origin of Species, Darwin even said, "I think I shall avoid the whole subject." The Cambridge academic Jane Ellen Harrison recognised Darwin's reticence to deal with issues relating to our human situation when she wrote that Darwin foresaw that his doctrine must have, for the history of man's mental evolution, issues wider than those with which he was prepared personally to deal. But as we are going to see in this chapter, many who purport to be biologists, such as E.O. Wilson, have shown no such scruples about trying to explain human behaviour when they couldn't confront the human condition. Indeed, they haven't been interested in explaining human behaviour at all, only in using their claimed stature as a biologist to invent a way to avoid the issue of the human condition. Yes, any truthful analysis of our human condition, its origins and its amelioration, requires a fundamental, new, honest foundation in thinking that recognises the involvement of our conscious mind and our species' departure from an original, cooperative, loving state, as well as the psychosis and neurosis it has produced in us. It has to acknowledge that our condition is a psychological one, that our conscious mind is deeply psychologically troubled, that we are a psychotic and neurotic, immensely alienated species. This is the point Lang was emphasising when he wrote that our alienation goes to the roots. The realisation of this is the essential springboard for any serious reflection on any aspect of present interhuman life. Chapter 2.8 The Ultimate Paradox of the Human Condition. So, if we do have a cooperative past, which we do, and our consciousness is behind our destructiveness, which it is, then the ultimate paradox of the human condition, indeed the reason we are still able to get out of bed in the morning and face the world, is that, as mentioned in chapter 1.3, we fully conscious humans don't actually believe we are fundamentally bad or evil. Despite all the damning evidence, we don't accept that we are a terrible mistake, a worthless blight on this planet, the face of absolute evil. In fact, the incredible determination with which we live our lives bespeaks of a core belief within us all that we are not only not bad or evil, but the great heroes of the story of life on earth, and that one day we will be able to explain why that is true. It follows then that while awaiting the exonerating, liberating explanation of our present egocentric, competitive, selfish and aggressive condition, we couldn't afford to concede that we did once live in an innocent, all-loving instinctive state that was corrupted by the emergence of our conscious mind. Accepting such truth without the full, clarifying explanation for it would have left us unbearably condemned as bad and worthless, sentenced to a state of completely insecure, permanent damnation. So, as dishonest as it was, there has been a need to deny the truth of our species' cooperative, peaceful past, and the role consciousness played in its corruption. Yes, while, as has been emphasised, denial in science carried with it the great risk of becoming overly entrenched, rendering its practitioners incapable of fulfilling their fundamental responsibility of acknowledging the human condition confronting, not denying, fully accountable and human race-saving, true explanation of the human condition when it eventually arrived, it has been necessary in the interim, not just because we couldn't cope with the depression that resulted from trying to think about the human condition, but because we didn't believe we were fundamentally bad or flawed, or the face of absolute evil. Having explained and evidenced the fundamental elements involved in a true analysis of human behaviour, I will now describe how this denial in science led to the development of a litany of human condition avoiding, dishonest, not truly accountable biological theories on human behaviour, all of which will be exposed for the lies they are, including the most prominent and seductive offering of all, that which has been put forward by E.O. Wilson. Chapter 2.9 Social Darwinism. Prior to the development of science and its evasive offerings, humans had already found a way to avoid the condemning truths of a cooperative, all-loving, innocent past, and of a consciousness-induced fall from grace, which was to simply assert that nature is brutally competitive and aggressive, red in tooth and claw, as Tennyson put it in his 1850 poem Memoriam, and that's why we are. Basically, we looked around and saw that animals always appear to be fighting and competing with each other, and instead of acknowledging that our instinctive orientation is to be cooperative and all-loving, we said that our instincts are similarly ruthlessly competitive and aggressive. We said that we have brutal, savage animal instincts that our conscious mind has to somehow try to control. As was mentioned in paragraph 153, it was an absolutely brilliant excuse, because instead of our instincts being all-loving and thus unbearably condemning of our present non-loving state, they were made out to be vicious and brutal. And instead of our conscious mind being the villain, the cause of our corruption, the insecurity of which made us repress our instinctive self or soul or psyche and become psychotic, it was made out to be the blameless, psychosis-free, mediating hero that had to manage those supposed vicious instincts within us. It was all a terrible reverse of the truth lie, but a hugely relieving one for humans seeking relief from the human condition. What happened when Charles Darwin presented his idea of natural selection in his momentous book on the origin of species by means of natural selection was that the excuse that claimed we have savage, barbaric, backward, brutish, bestial, primitive animal instincts within us was supposedly given a biological basis through the misrepresentation of natural selection as a survival of the fittest process. Natural selection is the process by which some members of a population reproduce more than others in a given environment, and most significantly, in the first edition of The Origin of Species, Darwin left it undecided as to whether those individuals that reproduce more could be viewed as winners, as being fitter. However, in later editions, Darwin's associates Herbert Spencer and Alfred Russel Wallace persuaded him to substitute the term natural selection with the term survival of the fittest. While Darwin's friend and staunch defender, the biologist Thomas Huxley, described the term survival of the fittest as an unlucky substitution, from the point of view of humanity needing to contrive an excuse for its divisive, selfish, competitive and aggressive behaviour, it was a lucky substitution, because it reinforced the dishonest but human condition relieving argument that our instincts are competitive and selfish, and that we, in the sense of we being our conscious thinking self, are blameless. I should mention that later in Chapter 4, in paragraph 358, it will be explained that Darwin's original position, where he left it undecided as to whether those who reproduce more are fitter, was right, because being unconditionally selfless, where you give your life to help others and don't seek to reproduce more, can be a biologically meaningful, fitter outcome. How much we have adopted the false savage instincts excuse is apparent in how our conversations are saturated with comments like, "We are pre-programmed to try to dominate others and be a winner in the battle of life," and "Our preoccupation with sexual conquest is due to our primal instinct to sow our seeds," and "Men behave abominably because their bodies are flooded with must reproduce their genes promoting testosterone," and "We want a big house because we are innately territorial," and "Fighting and war is just our deeply rooted, combative animal nature expressing itself," and "Religions are merely our survival-driven group mentality expressing itself," and the most common comment of all, that it's just human nature to be selfish. Chapter 2.10 Sociobiology/Evolutionary Psychology. There were, of course, serious problems with this so-called social Darwinist contrived excuse that nature is selfish and that's why we are. For starters, it didn't account for instances in nature where selflessness occurs, such as in ant and bee colonies, where workers slave selflessly for the whole colony. And secondly, and most particularly, It didn't account for our instinctive memory of having lived in a cooperative, loving, Garden of Eden-like existence, which is our selfless, consider the welfare of others, born with instinctive moral nature, the voice of which is our conscience. Seeking to address these cracks in the argument, biologists developed a theory of sociobiology, with E.O. Wilson acting as its main proponent. Later known as evolutionary psychology, this theory explains, truthfully enough, that worker ants and bees are not actually being unconditionally selfless, truly altruistic, when serving their colony, because when doing so, they are fostering the queen who reproduces their genes, which means their apparent selfless behaviour is, in fact, just a subtle form of selfishness. They are helping the queen to selfishly reproduce their genes. But in terms of maintaining the primary agenda of avoiding the unbearable and unacceptable issue of the human condition at all costs, this idea of selfless behaviour actually being a subtle form of selfishness, where you indirectly promote the reproduction of your own genes by fostering others who are related to you, your kin, was then, not surprisingly, but in this case extremely dishonestly, commandeered to explain our moral instincts. Yes, it was claimed that our moral inclination to help others was no more than an attempt to reproduce our genes by supporting others whose genes we shared, with any anomalies put down to misplaced parental behaviour. As Wilson boldly summarised in his 1978 book on human nature, morality has no other demonstrable function other than to ensure human genetic material will be kept intact. And later in his 1998 book Consilience, even saying that Rousseau claimed that humanity was originally a race of noble savages in a peaceful state of nature, who were later corrupted. But what Rousseau invented was a stunningly inaccurate form of anthropology. So, in saying our moral soul is still basically selfish, the old nature is selfish and that's why we are selfish excuse was preserved. The same I'm going to determinedly avoid, not confront the human condition attitude had been upheld. The problem that then emerged, of course, was that this denigration of our moral self as nothing more than a subtle form of selfishness was both deeply offensive to and entirely inconsistent with what we all in truth know about our moral instincts, which is that they are unconditionally selfless, genuinely altruistic. As the journalist Brian Appleyard pointed out in 1998, biologists still have a gaping hole in an attempt to explain altruism. If, for example, I help a blind man cross the street, it is plainly unlikely that I am being prompted to do this because he is a close relation and bears my genes. And the world is full of all sorts of elaborate forms of cooperation which extend far beyond the boundaries of mere relatedness.